Okay, so we're gonna start because we actually have a lot of things to do, and I don't want to fall behind on any particular week, right? So next week we only have one day, but that's more than enough time for me to cover what is needed. Because the way I see it, my job is not to repeat what's in the textbook, and not to just go over publish your PowerPoints. Right? I think anybody can do that. Is to give you something on that, right, to help make better sense of it, which is one of the reasons we're taking the systems thinking and systems dynamics approach to understanding supply chain management. And so I started, because we had those problems the other day, you can see I started writing on this document, and we'll go through the reminders while we did it. But I wrote up here, supply chain management, SCM, versus logistics. And I think it was a critical point that I overlooked on Tuesday as we started just going over the course and going over what systems thinking and systems dynamics was. And so I'm going to ask you, what is the difference between supply chain management and logistics? When I was in the Air Force, all Air Force officers and the medical group have to go through certain stages before they can become a senior administrator. And one of those stages that they generally start you at is the logistics officer. Right? So why did they call it the supply chain management officer? Well, is there a difference between supply chain management and logistics? It's not a trick question. Legitimate question.
I would assume that logistics looks more into like if this product is no longer in manufacturing, then you have to figure out what's a substitute, how quickly you can get it, and what the price change is on that. Versus managing would be more of an overview, less specific.
Okay, so she's hot on the trail of actually what the difference is. And so a lot of resources that you look at will say that there really is no difference. They use them synonymously, right? But truly the difference is that logistics deals with an item. It deals with objects, right? So we have something that is moving within our organization from place to place. So that box of bandages, for example, that might be in the supply room at the animal hospital, and it has to get delivered to different, so it has to arrive, then it has to be delivered to some end user somewhere. And so that person is managing logistics. Supply chain management is managing the entire supply chain, right? And so this, I actually simplified, in making this, what my goal was to simplify the illustration in your textbook. So your textbook has this, what it calls the integrated supply chain image on one of the initial pages. And it has each one of these. It just shows a lot of different bodies under the supplier, and I just simplified it here. And the supply chain management is here. This is your organization. Is working across the entire supply chain, trying to manage this end and that end at the same time. So the logistics officer and the medical group and those facilities will deal with those things that are here, right? The supply chain manager is trying to work with the different suppliers, trying to work with different distributors, and work from this end to this end to make sure that what they need is actually available when it's needed. So this is really crucial to us, right? Because what did we experience during COVID? How many times do you hear supply chain? When we were talking during COVID, supply chain was interrupted. Prices went up because the supply chain was interrupted, right? And that deals with each one of these pieces. And it doesn't deal with only the stocks. We're going to start using stocks and flows here. These things represent, in your integrated supply chain illustration in the book, it doesn't have these pieces here. Because I'm starting to convert us to start to think about stocks and flows. And these were the areas of disruption, the flows, and also the resources. And that's what disrupted the entire supply chain during COVID. And people still claim that's the reason for a lot of the issues that we have. Okay, so now we know the difference between the two. We went in and we defined what supply chain is. I apologize for how I got out of that.
First, can you define logistics once more, please?
Logistics, the movement of materials within an organization. Some will extend it beyond the organization, but think of it as movement of materials, right? Whereas supply chain management is everything that makes that supply chain work. Now, if you look at Investopedia, they'll say they'll show that difference, but other places will really emphasize that they're almost indistinguishable in common parlance. We have to understand that our language evolves, and so it's okay that it becomes synonymous. But for our thinking, as we're going into it, learning it for the first time, we're going to conceive of it differently, right? And so we defined what systems thinking was. And what I really want us to understand about systems thinking, so I wrote the notes for you here, and I hope you can read it. I was at my desk trying to write it neatly, but I was also trying to write it in a big way that shows up on that camera, right? So it's a holistic approach to analysis that takes emphasis really away from those events and occurrences that we tend to focus on as managers. Who's here heard a term that somebody said, like, I'm just putting out fires all day? Right? That means there's a lot of problems occurring around the organization. I'm going out and I'm dealing with those things. They're focusing on the events and the occurrences, but not the larger system, the structure that actually produces the events and the occurrences. And so that's really what I want you to take away from that, is that we remove, systems thinking, we take emphasis away from those events and occurrences. It doesn't mean we're ignoring them. It just means we're taking emphasis away from them. And we're placing it on the constituent parts and the interrelationships. And again, I'm emphasizing that structure produces behavior. So even though I gave you a slinky, you've seen I got my new slinky, right? Right. So I have my metal one today. I showed you the box. And granted, these are not systems, even though I'm sure a chemist, particularly a metallurgist, would probably disagree with me. These are not meant to symbolize systems. They're just meant to symbolize the point that the box is a different structure, and the same forces, my hand and gravity, were acting on it, but they behave differently because the structure is different. So when I take this apart, it didn't drop as far as I had initially thought. Remember what I said? I thought it would go all the way down and bounce back up. But it does. And so we understand, we start thinking of structure producing the behaviors. And this was really important for us as managers when we're doing investigations, not just in the supply chain, but even clinical investigations. We look at the structure that produces the event instead of just the people involved. If you're a linear thinker, non-systems thinker, you focus on the person. You focus on the mistake they made and not everything else, all the parts and their interrelationships. So we can just talk about it, we can think of the Quaid twins when they were overdosed on heparin, the wrong dosage of heparin, but they came in the same packaging. Somebody, a linear thinker, would have focused on how can that nurse have made that mistake. And what do we do about this mistake? Oh my gosh, we're going to get sued. Whereas a system thinker sits back and says, let's look at all the parts involved. And they found that the medications were side by side and packaged almost the same. The Bristol Royal Infirmary, a lot of children died during heart surgery. And it was actually a structure that was created by the CEO that allowed that to happen. Because he wanted it to be a self-running organization. Well, I'm completely neglecting his own role, right? Let it be self-running. Let them do what they want. Let the surgeon that was causing those problems just learn without regard for the events that were occurring. And so that resulted in a very high number of infant deaths. Again, the system was the problem. The surgeon, yes, right? So we're not taking everything away from the events and occurrences, but we're taking emphasis away and looking at making sure we look at everything. So that's why we really want to make sure that we understand systems thinking. And no area in healthcare management lends itself to the topic better than supply chain management. We're even using the same language, like stocks and flows, right? Systems dynamics, we defined it, is really our attempt to evaluate system behavior over time. And I mentioned that it was, some will define it as a mathematical modeling approach, but if you ever explore it, for example, I added a link. So if you go to the end, what I just uploaded for you, that is the same handout, but it says annotated next to it. I added this link for you, systemsdynamics.org. That's the Systems Dynamics Society. And they produce all the same things that we're going to produce, but they use mathematical models because it produces it at much larger scale. And so with the Slinky, we definitely demonstrated, I think, the central insight into systems theory. relationship between structure and behavior. All right, so this brings us current. Do you guys have any questions? I probably should have started there, but I was a little excited. Do you guys have any questions so far? Things you've read, things you've thought about? Any housekeeping items for me in my need to think about? No? Okay. All right. Okay, so let's talk about systems for a second. More than a second. We're gonna define what systems are. And we need to understand that systems can be simple or complex. But either way, either way, so you can write right here, simple or complex. And that whole video thing, by the way, is a big giant experiment. I have no idea if this is going to actually be visible on it. I hope it is. So we're having two videos. Right? But either way, they have certain things in common. There are parts. We call them elements. Those are parts and parentheses. Elements. And we can rename them, we can identify this however we want, but I'm going to use interconnectedness. But you can say that they're interrelatedness, interdependencies, whichever helps you understand it better. That shows that the parts have some connection to each other and they influence each other. Can you guys read my writing? There is a coherent organization to it. I'm going to close this for a second so I can access that later on. We'll go right back to it. So we have elements, which are the parts. We have interconnectedness and a coherent organization, and it has to produce a behavior, it has to have a purpose. So let's go all the way back up to our basic illustration, that simplified illustration from your textbook. We can see that we have parts. Now this is the macro view, so it's just generally supplier, right? Generally the resource, generally a distributor, generally a customer or consumer, but we can say that there are parts. So what you're setting up in supply chain management is a system to make sure your organization has what it needs when it needs it. And ultimately that translates into your patient, your customer having what they need when they need it. Back to our robot example, surgical robot example, extending the reach of the surgeon out into the field. It was about the patient in the field who required the surgery. Again, producing that behavior of making sure we have what we need when we need it. So I think the chapter does a good job at selling in that one illustration that I only simplified right there, only for the sake of the paper, right? And selling that supply chain involves the entire system that we're using. So remember these four important parts to it. So if you're to determine whether or not you're looking at a system versus just a collection, you want to ask yourself some questions. Hey, can I identify parts? Right? Can I identify the parts? What are the questions you think you would ask? Right. Apparently not. I'll say elements. I was in the right parts, but I didn't think elements. you ask yourself? The authors use the term value quite a bit in there. So if you've been doing the reading, you will have noticed you've encountered that word a few times already. And in systems thinking, we're looking at parts that don't belong, they don't really contribute much to the overall thing. Cutting that out allows us to do things more cheaply, more efficiently, and that increases the value within the system. So I would have to ask, do the parts affect each other? If I see a bunch of things, do they affect each other? And then do they, together, produce an effect that's different from the effect of each one on its own? So, is it more than the sum of its parts? So I'm going to write out the full sentence I just said, just to make it clear. Do the parts together, produce an effect that is different from the effect of each one on its own. So is the sum, is it more than the sum of its parts? Another way of saying that. Let's read that in there. Is it more than the sum of its parts? So that is an I, walk over it, and an S, I, and a T. More than the sum of its parts. So what occurs to me is a football team during a game, an American football team, right, is more than the sum of its parts, right? Because the quarterback, I can get a field full of quarterbacks and all throwing the ball, but it doesn't do anything for the overall sport, right? So together, they all have a role to play. They're connected, and that relationship between each one of them produces, hopefully, a win, but at least produces a game, one way or the other. So it's more than the sum of its parts. And another important thing for us to remember is that parts do not have to be physical things. Here, we're talking a lot about physical things, but expertise, that's supposed to be an E there. Let's move the chord. Right? Or is there supposed to be a B apostrophe? I better look that up, right? Before I start using French words. But things like expertise, is that not something? Is that not an element that makes something what it is? We call it intellectual capital, right? So our people, we hire experts, for example. It's not the person, it's the surgeon that we need, a skilled surgeon. I don't know if that makes sense. All right, very good. So remember things like expertise, esprit de corps, they're all very important elements that are important. So, but we as human beings, we have biases that prevent us from being systems thinkers. That's why this study on the Harvard and MIT students revealed that they, even though they're all exceptional students, and they had an exceptional education, they were still deficient when they graduated on their understanding of systems and systems dynamics. And so now they're trying to remedy that problem. Because you come out and you can regurgitate facts and figures, but you couldn't put it together. And our biases make it so that we prefer facts and figures, refer tangible things, right? So I'm going to ask you this challenging question. Is it easier to think about the parts of the system or the interconnections of the system? What do you think is easier to think about? Go for it.
I think it's easier to use parts because parts is like the base, and the next interconnection to connect all of it. I think that's the more complicated part.
Well, that's exactly right. We have this bias. We tend to focus on the things we see, right? And so it's easier to focus on the parts and not the interconnections. And another thing to that is it's easier, when we talk about flows, it's easier to think about inflows than it is to think about outflows. Don't know why it is, but it's pretty common among human beings. All right, so we're going to talk about stocks and flows, and what I'm going to ask you to do to understand this. Do you have a question?
Is it also like, can it be the case where, you look at a system and think how would the interconnection of parts actually make a system that will work in this environment, and then we figure out the part. We identify the system first, and then we identify the parts.
I think that's the general approach is when you start backing up and thinking about system, you start to think about what are the relationships I want to have, and what do I want, what's the behavior I want to produce, right? And then what do I need to make that happen? And so I can't solely think about parts. We tend to think about pieces, right? But we need to think about the parts and their interrelationships. And oftentimes when you put together the system, you can eliminate parts because they didn't add value to the overall flow. So those, only one was in the 245 when I was talking about the system for decreasing the door-to-drug time and strokes in the hospital. When it used to be about an hour and 20 minutes, time is tissue. You literally lose millions of neurons per minute that your brain, that area of your brain is anoxic, meaning without oxygen. And so time really does matter. So that difference between 60 minutes and 120 minutes is huge for the patient, right? And a lot of hospitals, when they started to do their process flow, is where they started to create these process maps to try and figure out what the system was for them. They realized there were a lot of things that were happening that added no value whatsoever to the patient. And so we're able to, we usually wind up going back and eliminating those one day when we start applying ourselves to it, right? But what we tend to do is we take parts and we throw them together in hopes of producing something when we really need to think about the relationships all the way through. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's right.
So now let's talk about stocks and flows. The thing you're going to be doing starting on week 2 or 3, whenever you started, right, the near-peer simulation, you're going to be dealing with stocks.